Hello and welcome to this episode of The Churn. Today in conversation, we have two very interesting guests. One of them is based out of India and the other is based out of London. We have Dr. Makarand Paranjpe and Dr. Eric Kaufmann. Dr. Kaufmann serves as the professor of politics at University of Birkbeck and has written his recent book, The White Shift, really talks about immigration and the political problems associated with the same. Dr. Paranjpe is the director at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies in Shimla, and Dr. Paranjpe is a tall public intellectual whose work ranges from literature to politics at large. Welcome to the show, both of you. Eric, I would like to begin with you, with the polls now suggesting that Trump might lose. Where do you think this entire campaign, this concerted academic and intellectual campaign of delegitimizing democracy is going to go? Because the same people who propelled Trump to power a couple of years back are perhaps going to oust him from his public office. So where does the conversation really lead us?
Right, yeah. So I think that the first thing to bear in mind is, of course, the voting blocks are fairly, on party lines, are fairly solid in the U.S. So most voters for Trump are going to vote for him again. I think, given the polls, he's probably going to lose by a small amount this time. But I do think what's going to happen is you're going to have an entrenchment of the deep cultural divisions that characterize American politics. And just on that note of delegitimizing actually democracy, just in thinking about that, I think because Biden is in office, that conversation will go away out of the mainstream media and academia. But I think what you will find is certainly on the conservative side, a lot of attacks on the federal government and I just don't think the climate is going to change much at all. It'll just be that a different group will be in power.
Dr. Paranjpe, your thoughts, and please connect it to what's going on here in India.
Yes, I was just going to say that I'm not entirely sure that Trump will lose, because last time around I was wrong. I watched the debates carefully and I thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, but she did not. So a lot can happen between now and November, which can swing matters in the other direction. And as I was saying earlier in a little chat, I found when I was studying in the US that, a very personable and seemingly nice Democrat, like Jimmy Carter, lost. And to Ronald Reagan, who was an actor, B-grade actor, who was reading other people's lines. And I'm wondering, why did that happen? And I believe it happened because the American hostages were in Iran, and every day Walter Cronkite would talk about that on CBS Evening News. And basically, Carter was perceived as a weak leader. Now, what we are seeing is a ratcheting up of tensions between the US and China. And the attempt will be to project Biden as a weak leader, a wishy-washy weak leader. So we don't know how this is going to go. You mentioned about attacks on democracy. I'm not entirely sure I agree with you. I'll come to that in a moment. But first, I want to talk a little bit about India. I think I agree with Eric that these uncivil wars within democracies, large democracies like the US and India, are here to stay. Because I think that the power elites on both sides are deeply entrenched. And what we see is two competing, should I say, claimants to the deep state. And they're not going to be pushed away entirely. And in India, I feel, our supreme leader, Narendra Modi, is far more secure than Donald Trump. He comes up trumps in all ratings. And now, with his surprise landing in Ladakh, he scored at least a narrative and tactical victory over China. So the two situations are not similar. In fact, in India, we are actually witnessing another elite gradually displacing the older Nehruvian, secularist type of elite, and the new Hindutva type of elite is slowly entrenching themselves, and they're not going to be easy to dislodge, even if in the next elections things go in another direction. But the thing I want to really point to, apropos your question, is this amazing letter by over 150 people across the political spectrum in the wake of all these woke bullying, that we've seen across the spectrum, the censoring of public opinion. And you've got people like Salman Rushdie, Rawling, and all kinds of, Noam Chomsky, all kinds of people of all kinds of political opinion from Canada, the leading novelist, Margaret Atwood, coming out and saying, listen, we can be politically correct. We are against racial discrimination, but we can't go to the other extreme where we are going to have, kangaroo court, so to speak, pushing people out, sentencing them on social media. So what I'm really trying to say is that this letter is not going to be as easy to dismiss as Rawling's remarks about people who menstruate, So what I'm really trying to say is that the very people who were trying to create this, what you call the anti-democratic delegitimating of democracy, they are not going to get a walkover. And I think that in the new Cold War, which is emerging, one of the things people are going to sell is that nobody wants a system like China. Nobody wants to imitate the Chinese way of life. I mean, we'd rather risk COVID, than live in that kind of society. And therefore, I think we need to define the current, schisms in society in a slightly different way. That's my submission to you.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, I'm just going to pick up on, I don't know whether we want to deal with this issue of political correctness now, but I think that is a very live issue in the West, certainly. And I don't know in India whether it has yet made inroads, but what I think this is really that you have different norms operating in different parts of the society. So you can get elected, but at the same time, within all of the institutions, the universities, the large sections of the media and the corporations, you have a completely different culture operating, which is in many ways very authoritarian. So it will cancel you over interpretations of things. So as long as someone can interpret something you say in the most uncharitable light as racist or sexist or transphobic, then you can lose your job, not to mention other things like not being promoted or hired or, your reputation trashed. So and actually it feeds into the populism, oddly, because the populism is partly a response to political correctness, especially in America. There have been a number of academic survey experiments where if you take a Trump policy and you call it racist, then support for Trump will rise amongst some people. So there's a direct blowback effect of this increasingly these tight norm boundaries is sort of blowing back again, but it's again creating this polarization.
Eric, it's interesting that you talked about corporations and how the entire debate is being hijacked by the authoritarians. I would like to bring to you the note of places like Twitter and Facebook, who came in as a democratic platform where you can have all shades of opinion. There would be a battle of ideas out there in the open. And suddenly you take this corporate takeover of the left by the leftists, and they have no political correctness to come out. And actually they've put out their political manifesto in the open, have openly said that we are leftists and we are going to remain so. How do you see this, both of you, and any one of you is free to answer this question, add to it. How do you see this gradual takeover of the corporate offices by the leftists?
Well, I think so. We have to bear in mind that what we're seeing is a transposition of the left away from class categories like bourgeoisie and proletariat to a new set of cultural categories around disadvantaged racial and to some extent gender and sexuality groups, but particularly race is top of the totem pole. And so people of color versus whiteness or white males is the new proletariat versus bourgeoisie. And so that sort of oppressor-oppressed worldview begins in academia, and then it spreads out into sections of the media and now into the corporations. Now, there's always been some bleed into the corporations. Samuel Huntington even wrote about that in 2004 in his book, Who Are We? But it's just become more intense, and more of the corporations, as you've seen with this Black Lives Matter thing, they are completely on board, because the young people that they've hired, like the HR directors, have inculcated this culture. And it's important to note that all it takes is a few people to be the moral innovators, and everybody else, it's like a herd. You just turn a few sheep in one direction, and everyone else will follow, because no one wants to be accused of what is seen as sort of the worst thing you could be accused of, which is, being racist or sexist. So these taboos really have been enforced by small numbers of people within these organizations, and then those organizations, once they are captured in a way, they then discipline each other. And so the whole thing is like a cascade of dominoes once you actually tip the dominoes. So that's now going full swing, and that then runs into the resentments of people who vote for Trump, and you get this, and actually it even powers some of the Trump vote.
Dr. Paranjpe, I think after every few days, there is an uproar on Twitter or on Facebook, especially on Twitter, I think, of accusing Twitter of ideological bigotry. And what do you have to say to that? Please contextualize it in our context.
Well, I'm told the Saudis own a lot of stock in Twitter. So, we know the Omidyar network and George Soros and others. Everybody's seen the power of media. And I tend to agree with Eric that, most of us on this planet are followers. And we need, I think the problem with Twitter and Facebook and other social media platforms is that you don't have to think deeply. You don't have to work out your positions. You can simply, follow the herd. But there are a few of these sheep dogs which are leading the sheep on. And I think that it's a much more complicated power struggle going on behind the scenes. But I want to return to this letter that Thomas Chatterton Williams wrote or generated for Harper's. And he wrote, I think he told the New York Times, "We are not just a bunch of old white guys sitting around writing this letter, etc. It includes plenty of black thinkers, Muslim thinkers, Jewish thinkers, people who are trans and gay, old and young, right wing and left wing. We believe these values are widespread and shared, etc." So, and look at his own background. I think his dad was African American, his mother was white. So, all I'm trying to say is that it's not going to be a walkover as we can imagine. I mean, the bullying in the name of political correctness, a reinvention of identity politics, So it's a moment of woke revolutions, But, these revolutions don't have the depths of, either the French Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution. I think they are trend-driven. They're driven also by money. And, like the stock market, somebody was telling me it's a very uncertain world out there until the US elections are won or lost. There's going to be so much manipulation of the stock market because, people need to feel good to vote and so forth. So I think for ordinary people who are reasonably educated, the real challenge is not so much which side to support, but the real challenge is to try to sift, the truth or whatever resembles the truth, whatever is more reliable. I mean, content sifting, I think, and being able to filter through all these layers, of subterfuge and camouflage to arrive at some reliable information on which to base their opinions and choices. I think, that is the challenge for all democracies because, we are so susceptible to manipulation today, which is much more insidious than just the so-called idiot box. We are inundated with misleading information. And I think we need a new program of education or a new toolkit for young people to sift through some of this and actually exercise their democratic responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got a kind of a politics of unreason coming from both the right and the left. On the right, some of what Trump says, some of what the populists say is clearly conspiratorial and not fact-based. And then you get, in the universities, you get these, you can call it post-positivist critical theory, postmodernist to some degree, this idea that the scientific method is somehow a Western white hegemonic thing that must be overthrown. And so once you're into that paradigm, there is no truth anymore, and it's just a matter of who shouts louder and who can shame the other. And that's kind of getting stronger, I would say, in Western universities. There doesn't seem to be a lot of resistance because too many people are scared they don't want to run afoul of the wrong people and be accused of things. Only if you're Steven Pinker, that's fine. He can take a stand. He's a big name. But if you're smaller than that, and you get someone smears your reputation, might be hard to get a job, to get a grant, to get invited places. So they work on this smearing your brand, smearing the surface reputation. They don't actually deal with arguments. And as long as people are willing to sort of buy into that ethos, and I'm afraid too many people are in these universities.
Yes.
Then
yes.
Yeah.
I agree. I think it's competitive intolerance and bullying. I was thinking about this Canadian star, politically incorrect Professor Jordan Peterson again.
Right.
You have to create your image in such a way that you have to, only then can you resist this kind of bullying. And
once you're out of the closet, but then again, you have to have a certain security, or else your life can be very hard for you. And I think we know from surveys that a lot of academics will discriminate politically, and people know this, so you just don't want to stick your neck out because you want a nice life.
Yeah, glad that we got Dr. Peterson and also Camille Paglia, somebody like her. It's very it has, both of them have suffered so much in their careers because of the views that they have, because of the arc that they followed in their intellectual careers. In fact, I want to bring both of you back to your campuses. Now, Thomas Piketty interestingly talks about the Brahmin left and the merchant right, which really explains the sociological arc of political preference. Where do you see this? How do you see this kind of categorization?
Well, I just if you look at the elections data, it's really quite striking in Britain, for example, that the Conservative Party and the Labour Party have the same class composition now, whereas the rule right through to the Tony Blair years in the 1990s has always been that the middle class voted for the Tories and the working class voted for Labour. That's completely upside down now because of the Brexit issue, which is predominantly working class is overrepresented in the Brexit vote. And so what you see is increasingly the white working class has moved over to the Conservatives. And that's happened all across Europe, where the mainstream left parties have had have had basically their worst results since the Second World War in a string of different countries: Austria, France, Sweden, Britain. You've had country after country, the left is in sort of large-scale decline. And that's mainly because the meaning of the left has shifted from sort of defense of the working class to defense of culturally disadvantaged groups, which has an appeal to urban intellectuals and to some young liberals in the college towns and cities, but not to the sort of broad white working class who has moved over to either populist right parties or in some cases to the center right. And so, I think, and you see that in Trump as well. He did much better on the people without college degrees. Whereas if you were to go back to Reagan would have won more wealthy, college-educated Americans.
Dr. Paranjpe, you have served in one of the most controversial spaces in public discourse. You've served in JNU, and we all know that iconic video where you've been really barred from taking your own classes, barred from getting into your own space to work. How do you read this hijack of intellectual space by the leftists?
Well, in JNU, of course, it was the bastion of the left, and it's a reverse revolution the right is taking over, and obviously it's their last ditch stand. I've got a book coming out in JNU called JNU, Nationalism in India's Uncivil Wars, where I document this whole thing and, try to explain it. I mean, the decline of the left, also of the liberals, has to do with their own hypocrisy, their own inability to condemn, let's say Islamist or jihadist terrorism or illiberalism in the name of a religious, whatever identity minority. And so they're losing, I think, ground there. But and this is their chance, bringing statues down, trying to capture and capitalize on the resentment of the have-nots. But, to come back to this Brahmin merchant Thomas Piketty point, doesn't work in India because the merchants are the Banyas, Brahmins and the Banyas are both very much on the right, more or less, in India. But I think what he's really trying to say is that economically disadvantaged working class people, even in the United States, I mean, they voted Trump. They were the so-called rednecks, who made a difference. They were traditionally Democrat, going back to Teamsters and all those, the Machine in Chicago, Daley and Mayor Daley and the Machine and so forth. But they ended up voting Trump because of that sense of being left out. And the wealthier people, embarrassed by the right-wing surge, turned to the left a little bit. So I think that's what he's saying. But for me, what's more important in Piketty's point is simply that both sides are controlled by elites.
Yes.
So it's not working class versus the elites and parties representing working class classes versus parties representing, privileged classes. It's just two different elites really fighting to the finish. To that extent, is the same thing in India. The so-called Lutyens' Delhi, which is the left liberal cabal, if you like, promoted by the Congress party, is now really feeling the heat because, their privileges and patronage networks are being snipped gradually. And a new group of people are now taking over. And therefore, what you're seeing is these pitched battles for territory, But do they really signify some huge, major new revelation? I don't think so. I think I'm not an economist, and now I'm old enough not to engage with any research just because it's trendy. I want to go deeper and try to understand things in a deeper sense. And what I think Piketty's big takeaway is that somehow democratic societies are also deeply unequal societies, and those of us who love freedom must somehow come to terms with this and must accept it to some extent. Europe has gone for the welfare state model, very high taxation. I've lived in Europe, I've lived in Germany, a lot of unemployment, and basically a small productive group of people trying to take care of the rest of society. And once you have refugees at your door, and once you have recessions and other such economic problems, then this model starts unraveling, And we know that the top 8 or 10 richest people in the world own more money, have more wealth than 50-60% of the world's population. Now, this is ridiculous. But notice also how we have extra state agency now, with a bunch of philanthropists getting together and creating mechanisms which are almost going to rival the IMF or World Bank. Who knows? Maybe Bill Gates' foundation is the one who's going to, create this new vaccine to save humanity, within quotes. So what I'm trying to say is the world is in a state of churn, and you have plutocrats in China. It's the Communist Party and their children who own everything. It doesn't mean they're more equal. So if you're just going to try to, kind of sort of steamroller, over inequality in the name of political correctness, I think we're going to risk losing, the very freedoms that we cherish. So I think what I'm trying to say is there's going to be a much more, intense and sharper, I think, tussle between the free and the unfree. and the free societies with all their messiness, and all their cracks and whatever you want to call them, fissures and fault lines, are still going to, I think, be able to cope somewhat better, despite their violence and social unrest, than unfree societies where you've got forced sterilizations, new kinds of concentration camps, and ways of controlling the populace, which we don't even know, exist in all their details, because there's no reliable information coming out of those places.
Right. Professor Eric, you wanted to add something?
Well, no. I mean, I would agree with certainly this idea of free societies, despite their warts, being a better alternative to the authoritarian model. But what I was going to say, though, is this one thing that hasn't been mentioned with regard to the Piketty argument is this shift from economics to culture, which is something I mentioned with regard to the left, this cultural turn of the left from the bourgeoisie and proletariat to people of color and whiteness and all of this. And if you look at, certainly in the West, the white working class, what's going on is actually the economic redistribution welfare policies are reasonably uncontroversial. I mean, of course, we can have a debate over how much redistribution there should be, but that is not really the issue. The issue is much more the kind of cultural questions around immigration, around political correctness, multiculturalism, and to some extent social conservative questions around crime and the family. Those are really the battlegrounds, the culture wars battlegrounds, and it's that pivot from the older left-right economic questions to the cultural that is defining the West right now.
Yeah, what I was trying to say, just to clarify, is that the moral panic in Western societies is occasioned deep down, I feel, because they feel the welfare state is going to fail, and you can keep printing money and keep pretending to just distribute it, but debt levels, state debt, I mean, look at the US debt, it's so high. And the fear really is, I mean, China owns more US paper than anybody else, trillions and trillions of dollars. So I think normal people have, in a sense, they feel so befuddled by this new world. And I mean, the insecurity is massive because they don't know whether the comforts they take so for granted in advanced capitalist societies are going to be available to their children any longer. And you've got a new normal, which is that a lot of young people don't have jobs, especially in Europe. They stay with their parents, they're raising families. I mean, they're just becoming socialists of a different kind. The type of people Bernie Sanders appeals to. So all I'm trying to say is that the economic situation, with its massive inequalities and social confusion, is actually extremely uncertain and unpredictable. Whereas in countries like India, people have much more focus because, the drive to just enter the middle class. There's still maybe half a billion people in India or more just trying to barely get into the middle class. So we don't have that kind of situation, and all this crisis with the migrant workers in India is basically highlights this issue that we don't have these problems that the West has, and the West is simply playing around with as you said, political correctness, identity politics, multiculturalism, looking for causes. But deep down, there's a lot of confusion. Think about Occupy Wall Street. I mean, there's a large group of people who have tremendous resentment, which feeds into the anarchism, but it keeps fizzling out because, it gathers just enough momentum to attract attention, and then it fizzles out because it doesn't have a center, it doesn't have a fulcrum to hold it. This is my point, because there's no visible, solution, no revolution in place as an ideal to fight for. So what are you doing? You're just fighting these pitched battles over as he says, as Eric was saying, race, post-colonialism, taking down statues, this, that, and the other. And as I said, the most impassioned are also, very, very, should I say, ill-informed. I saw a program in which somebody came onto the BBC, and the lady was asked, well, what do you think about, taking down statues of Churchill? So she says, I haven't met him as yet, but I'm told he was a very racist person, So you've actually got people like this coming onto, mainstream media and actually, exposing, how shallow some of these political struggles are.
Right, but I think for them this is sort of a religion, a political religion. It's sort of something they've invested deeply in. It's a sort of expressive project, and that's one of the reasons why there are very few actual policy ideas. I mean, yes, there are some anarchist ideas like open borders, abolish the police, all these crazy things, but nothing really workable and tested. But I think that sort of speaks to this very millenarian, expressive, religious sort of tone to a lot of this, and it is mainly the well-off, the kids of the well-off occupy. If you look at the demographics of these movements, it is heavily the children of well-off or well-educated people. It is not people who are just unemployed or struggling economically. I don't think this is really about economics at all, I'm afraid. I think this is all about a kind of expressive religious left-wing politics, which is actually got a lot of power, particularly amongst millennials. I'm not sure Generation Z could be something different, but it looks, this is a sensibility. They get it in their social media feeds from celebrities. They jump on these bandwagons, and it's all, there is behind it, though, I think a kind of utopianism, which is that, well, we can somehow overthrow whiteness and maleness. We're going to come into this multicultural utopia without boundaries, without hierarchy. It's very, very woolly. It's got no real policy behind it, but it is.
That's why. Sorry, go on. No, I was saying that's why it has more resonance in India, because the people, the real working classes in India, they're an unorganized working class, and they're so busy just trying to make ends meet and get a better life, that it doesn't have the kind of traction, is what I'm saying, as people in developed societies, economically developed societies, who have a welfare state base from which to launch into this new religion, as you were saying.
Right. But in India, though, what about the educated elite on the left? I mean, how much do some of these cultural radical ideas enter there, and what are the cultural categories they're fighting for? I'd be interested.
I think in India they're so much under attack. One of our famous movie stars, who's a crossover movie star, she was extremely successful in India, and then in the US she was in a major serial, she's in movies. So when the Black Lives Matter movement took off, she immediately tweeted about racism and color consciousness, and in India she got so badly trolled and slammed because she used to promote fairness creams, whitening creams. So in India, I think that these tired slogans and shibboleths are now coming under very sharp attack, and I think our left liberal politics now is not only a little bit on the back foot, but is really clueless how to negotiate. A new nationalism, if you like, a re-nationalism, I would call it, not a neo-nationalism, but a renationalization of our public sphere.
Right.
Also, I would want both of you to comment a little bit on the cultural aspect of all the conversations we had. Culture really is at the center of these discussions. Eric, your book, which basically focuses on demographies, has elaborated to a great extent on this issue. The specific question which I have for you is this whole conversation on diversity, especially in the West, vis-a-vis the migration question. How do you think you navigate a question of diversity when, if we look at the genesis of the BLM protests, for that matter, not to say that blacks were not being discriminated and are not being discriminated against, but somehow a crime committed went into the background, and suddenly we have this whole movement created out of a completely different context. So is diversity the buy all and end all? What are your comments on that?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think this idea of ethnic and social diversity is very much bound up with this religion of anti-racism, which John McWhorter, who's an African-American writer, and a really perceptive article called Anti-Racism, Our New Religion in the Daily Beast, I think it was. He sort of talked about this as white liberals needing this religion in which it's got a sort of pseudo-Christian structure where you have the sins of the white man, which is you then atone for, and you can get redemption by being an ally and bowing down to the high priest, someone like a Ta-Nehisi Coates or Ibram Kendi. You're not supposed to question any of his arguments. You just bow and you say amen, right? So you have this kind of idea that diversity really becomes an end in itself. You can't be against it. There can never be too much of it. And so you can't begin to start to say, well, okay, how fast should immigration be? Should we have assimilation or not? No, assimilation becomes a bad word. Any opposition to immigration becomes equal to racism. So all these things are being bundled into this charge of racism, which essentially shuts down conversations. If you want to, the connection between political correctness and the rise of the populist right is not so much, it's partly a direct reaction, but it's also the fact that the political correctness permeates into government and makes it impossible to have immigration policies that large sections of the people want. So they cannot reduce immigration levels because of this political correctness. And so what happens is the only people who can talk about this is the populist right. And that's what happened in the United States. Trump was the only one of 17 candidates to really make illegal immigration central, which is an issue that nobody really had wanted to address because it was uncomfortable. Similarly, you can look in Britain or in Sweden, you can see the Sweden Democrats, the mainstream parties didn't want to talk about immigration levels because, again, of these taboos. So the taboos aren't just on college campuses. They then shut down. It's a bit, I use the metaphor of a Soviet department store where you're only allowed to sell one color pair of pants. Well, who's going to sell the other pair of pants, the blue jeans that people want? Well, someone who's running the black market. And so what happens is once the political correctness narrows the permitted conversation in the mainstream, you get the populist right, who are like a political black marketeer popping up. So in a way, these two things are related. And then, of course, once the populist right emerges, that freaks out the radical left, and then you get this ratcheting up and polarization, which is really where the U.S. is in, and where I'm afraid Britain and the rest of the West is being dragged in as well.
Dr. Paranjpe, before you comment on that, I just wanted to ask you one thing, like very recent, something which happened today, Vivek Dubey's encounter. Now, there are all kinds of identity politics being done around his surname too. And so imagine a society in India where we have somebody like a Sharzil Imam, somebody like a Vikas Dubey, somebody like a Kuldeep Singh, all together, getting into this really diverse, very multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual, and all kinds of combinations possible. Is that enough to solve the problem that our country faces?
Well, I don't think this kind of rainbow coalition of the disenfranchised and the, should I say, disenchanted is going to happen in India, because the question in India is totally different. It's really about what it means to be a Hindu today, So I'll come back to that in a moment. But what I wanted to say is that, when you observe the West, the climate warriors have been replaced by the culture warriors. And we never thought this would happen. Long ago, in Commonweal, Terry Eagleton said that post-colonialism is somehow not authentic because it substitutes class struggle, which is the real basis of the left, with these cultural and identity politics issues, which to him are epiphenomenal. They're not really the concerns of the left. So what I'm simply trying to say is that the evangelical, frameworks of the climate warriors were There is the original sin of being, consumers, and then the redemption through these climate warriors who are the saviors of the planet, and the atonement that comes by, beating yourself up and trying to reduce your footprint, and then railing against government somehow, asking them to legislate away the kind of life you're used to leading. So, that has suddenly given way to these cultural warriors who are once again railing against authority, establishment, and all the things, the so-called pillars of society, or should I say the statues of society. Now, in India, what's happening is totally different. I just wrote a piece on Vikas Dubey, this brigand who was gunned down in an encounter this morning at 6:30. And my argument was there's a direct line from Mother India, where, in the newly independent country, which is all about Nehruvian, the development project of Nehru, this mother has two children. And one of them becomes an outlaw, one of them becomes a dacoit, and she shoots him down. So what's playing out in UP are the dominant castes as the new subalterns, who, because of being the victims of, reservation and the overcorrections of caste politics, are now left with no choice but to take the law into their own hands. And Dabang, there's a film called Dabang where the Chulbul Pandey, he's a cop, but he breaks all the laws, himself. So I've written about this, and I've talked about this phenomenon of those who are, abjected, to use Julia Kristeva's terminology, who've become monsters because they've been, pushed out of society and have been, forced to sort of become outlaws. And then they, like Bonnie and Clyde, during the Depression, and then they go around shooting people and become, almost heroes at one level. But the big point here is that the Sarjeel Imams, or that other guy, Shah Rukh, remember in the Shaheen Bagh and the CA protest, there was this guy called Shah Rukh who was a member of a gang, and he pointed a pistol at a cop and became this big hero. Now, the Shah Rukhs of the world and the Vikas Dubeis are not going to join, because there's not only a caste divide there, but a religious divide. So I think in India, the question is not of this pseudo-religion of political correctness or cultural activism. I call it pseudo-religion because, it's still very, very ill-organized, and though it has some high priestesses and so forth, priests. But in India, it's really about what it means to be a Hindu, what it means to belong to a majority, which somehow majoritarianism was considered really bad. It was considered bad faith. So, in other words, the majority was actually the minority, in the sense that if you are a minor, it means you're not grown up. So suddenly, you have the majority having reached the age of majority. In other words, actually seizing political power, deciding the course of both economic and social policy. And then what do you do with this newfound power? Are you going to just smash down everything that existed earlier? Tear down the so-called Nehruvian fabric of India and substitute it with a Hindu nation along Savarkar's lines, where the Muslims or others will become so-called second-class citizens unless they kowtow to majority icons, ideals, values, etc. Or are we still negotiating between, the soft Hindutva advocates and the hard Hindutva advocates, and always looming behind these debates is the specter of Pakistan, where Hindus have been practically wiped out, So they're always going to whip up that frenzy and of fear that, look, we told you so. You're a dying breed. And I wanted to point, Eric, to this wonderful distinction that Max Muller makes long ago between two kinds of religions, he says, So there's one kind of religion which proselytizes and takes converts, and the other kind which gives up its numbers And he said the Jews and the Hindus, and I think the Jains he named are the non-proselytizing type, and they're doomed to die out because the others, the Christians and the Muslims and the Buddhists to some extent, and of course later the communists, are the proselytizers, and they're going to keep recruiting newer and newer, should I say, members into their communities or into their communion. And so you've got two sets of religious identities: the dying and the predatory, so to speak. And I think your work, to some extent, bears this out, but not entirely, because here's the thing, Shubrata ji, I want to put to Eric that, in closed systems, in open systems, in some sense, Hinduism is an open system. The threat is always from the outside, usually from the outside. Somebody is attacking you, whether it's a secular attack by the Macaulay'ites or the religious attack by the missionaries, and how it gets played out over and over again. But in closed societies, I don't think the attack is so much from the outside, but there's an implosion from the inside. Like in communist China or even in the Middle East, it's the women who are protesting, whether it's in Iran or Saudi Arabia. And we don't know exactly what's happening, but the change is from within. And it's not actually, of course, there's pressure and attraction, blandishments from the outside. But so I think that Max Muller was only partly right. And that's all I can say. I think that religions that don't seem proselytizing are still attractive somehow.
Well, I think, it's important to get into the numbers, I think, in the demography of all these. So in Britain, for example, Islam is a proselytizing religion, and most of the population of Britain is non-religious or only very nominally Christian. But the direction of assimilation and intermarriage is such that typically, if a Muslim marries out to the white British population, their kids are much more likely to leave Islam, and so the net direction through assimilation is actually away from Islam, even though demographically, obviously, Islam is growing mainly through immigration and fertility. So you have to kind of, I don't know in India whether, there's very little intermarriage. That's the one issue. So I would have thought, for example, that intermarriage would be one route through which Hinduism might expand if this was a permitted thing, right? But I don't have the numbers in India. I just know it's very rare. That's all.
Yeah.
But just to say that I do think in terms of managing the ethnic diversity and how you mesh that with a national identity, what I sort of favor is this term multivocalism, in which you have a different type of national identity. If you're a minority, you would tend to identify with different symbols and different historical episodes within the layers of the past than somebody from the majority. And each person could identify in their own way. So it might be that landscape and history in this country, typically you're more conservative, and white British person is more attached to those things than ethnic minorities, who might be more attached to certain urban landscapes. They might be attached to the National Health Service. They might be attached to the idea of Britain's diverse cultural life and toleration. So there would be different aspects that they are identifying with as their Britishness. I don't see a problem with that. So I think you can have a flexible symbolic menu. It's like a menu. Different groups tend to pick different items on the menu, but as long as they're on the menu and not off it, I think it can work. But of course, that's not going to be congenial to everybody, and there are certainly people trying to push a quite strong multiculturalism in which difference is prized and difference alone, and any kind of attempt at assimilation or similarity is derided. And then this is as part of this religion of anti-racism, what I call left modernism, which prizes diversity as a good in and of itself. So anything that would strive for unity is suspect. And so that's part of the problem we face here. But I do think it's possible to have a diverse society that is nonetheless also celebrating things in common.
Right. I think I'll have a final comment from both of you on the future of campus politics globally. We have had a global conglomerate of the left. Do you see a global conglomerate of the non-left? I wouldn't really say the right, but do you see a global conglomerate of the non-left really shaping up the discourse around the times that we are in?
Well, I mean, I'll just say I believe it's already happening, but I also think that the hold that the left has on the university is simply too strong because of the impact of herding and shaming and taboos. It's going to take, and I know libertarians won't like this, but I think governments are going to have to be much more regulatory, and they're going to have to sit on top of universities and force them to create, basically to issue a report every year on all of their, whether they've abided by freedom of speech, and if they haven't, then they need to be fined repeatedly until they are. And actually, I think that the universities themselves will respond to these financial incentives, so that when the mob comes and says, fire this person, they'll say, well, we might agree with you, but we can't because otherwise we're going to get fined. End of conversation. So I think that's the only way it's going to be broken.
Right. Professor Paranjpe.
Well, I think Eric is absolutely right, but I think the university itself is in the process of getting dematerialized. I mean, the idea of the university as a campus in which people congregate, partly because of this COVID pandemic. And look at the way we are talking just now. There are going to be universities up in the clouds now. And I think that apart from the regulatory mechanisms that Eric spoke of, I think the so-called non-left has to work much harder at creating alliances, networks, systems of patronage. They have to read and support each other's work and also discriminate between, value and just ideology. I mean, there are really good ideas based on, data, ideas based on deep thinking, and they're just reactive ideas, on both sides. And possibly not succumb to the same kind of ganging up and bullying. Actually provide viable alternatives, because there's always going to be a sliver of the best students all over the world who are searching for something more meaningful, and they're not going to get carried away. So I think our work is cut out for us. And I think precisely platforms such as yours, Shubhrashtaji, are going to play a key role in catalyzing these new networks. Whereas the others, the more entrenched ones, they're well-oiled mechanisms based on fellowships and collaboration, publisher networks, journal, peer review. And we can't match that. We can't either substitute that system which is already in place or create an alternative system easily, which can dislodge it or give it a run for its money. We have to be smarter, a little more of guerrilla warfare. And but I'm hopeful, because I think there's, no matter how much you talk about diversity, I really believe that there's one human culture, with all its beautiful varieties, and actually human beings, actually go along and they imitate best practices. You can't fool them. If you've got a really, really good product, then everybody wants it. And ideas are also products at one level. There is a deeper pragmatism which determines flows of ideas. And you can't be fooling people all the time, I mean, therefore, that's why religions which are very dogmatic, they need fear and policing all the time. But good ideas don't need that. They just permeate across borders. And, look at genotypes and phenotypes. There's no genetic change when people become Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist, So I think human culture, with all its diversity, I would rehumanizing our campuses, and despite trying to, get out of that project, and I think that's waiting to happen in one form or another.
Yeah, I hope so. But I'm not sure. At the present, things look quite bleak because the proponents of emotional safety as the trump card for everything, so anything that makes me feel offended or uncomfortable has to be shut down. I mean, that attitude is gaining power in the West, hopefully in India, you could resist that.
Thank you, both of you, for taking out time. I know both of you have very, very busy lives, academic and intellectual. Thank you for doing this with us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Subrata ji. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.